So I'm going to talk about outsourcing, and in particular, I'm going to talk about the what I call the life cycle perspective of outsourcing. Let's just start with some of the basics of outsourcing. There is a very famous, The World is Flat. It's written by Tom Friedman, and this is his view that the world is really becoming very interconnected, and he identifies the internet and the use of technology as one of those kind of elements which are facilitating this. And I think the fact that I'm giving you a lecture today from Singapore, and you as students can potentially be anywhere in the world, I think that's a good example that the world is indeed flat, and obviously technology is playing a critical role there. In fact, in terms of the IT industry, the business processing industry, there's a lot of outsourcing that's happening around the world these days. And this guy, Nandan Nikalani, who's the chairman of Infosys. Infosys, as you know, is one of the big technology services companies, originally from India, but now it's 60,000 employees across the globe. I think it's clear that certainly within the IT industry, this has really transformed the way in which IT services are delivered these days. And I think that's affected a lot of other industries as well. If you look at the financial services industry, you look at financial transaction processing, you look at financial systems, a lot of that type of activity is being outsourced these days. So outsourcing is it's just not it's not a small idea, it's not a small project. Some people would argue that outsourcing is really about restructuring of the business. So it's a very radical kind of initiative. It's driven by a number of different things. One is globalization, hyper-competition, and by that I mean simply that organizations are becoming more and more competitive in the global space. The other driving factor is the knowledge economy. We talk less about physical goods these days, and we talk about knowledge services, services which require people and brain power, and that's really the knowledge-based view of the economy. The other element, the other driver, if you like, is that organizations are saying, look, we got to focus on our core competency. So in the case of a bank, they don't want to compete on technology anymore. They want to compete on banking. So technology is one aspect of their business that they can outsource. And so you have a whole industry of outsourcing providers who are very good in working in a particular area, and they allow companies to focus on their core competence. In the case of U21 Global, for example, if you look at this webinar session, the webinar tool is provided by a company called WebEx. They specialize in webinar technology. There's really no point in U21 Global as a business school developing its own webinar technology there. So outsourcing is part of the restructuring process that some businesses are going through. Of course, in the manufacturing sector, outsourcing has been around for a very, very long time. We hear a lot about, Chinese manufacturers, Chinese manufacturing, and, that's just part of what's happening in the manufacturing industry these days. If you have an Apple iPod, and I'm sure a lot of people do, it's actually assembled and manufactured in China. So a lot of products and services are manufactured in different locations from where they were originally designed. It's just an example of what's happening. The same thing with aircraft. If you look at an aeroplane like the Boeing 787, you'll actually find that different components are made in different countries. So the wing of an aircraft is made in Japan. The wing tips are made in Korea. The fuselage is made in the U.S. There are different parts of the aircraft which are made in different places, and outsourcing is kind of part of that whole, because Boeing would outsource different elements of the aircraft to different countries, different companies, and they may then outsource different parts of that even further to different suppliers. So you have the idea of tier 1 and tier 2 suppliers there. There's just an example of outsourcing in the manufacturing industry. In the IT industry, we've had 20 years of outsourcing, and we've had a lot of different trends over the 20 years. In the early days, we had these huge kind of outsourcing mega deals. These are deals which are 5-10 years in duration, and you have big companies like IBM or EDS, and these are basically deals worth hundreds of millions of US dollars there. So these were the outsourcing mega deals that we saw a few years ago. Since then, we've seen a lot of smaller single source deals, where instead of outsourcing the whole kind of IT functionality, different parts of that would be outsourced to different providers. So then we have the idea of selective outsourcing. So you selected different providers who could support different parts of the services that you were looking after. And of course, that also evolved into what we call multi-sourcing. So as a company, you might have a set of vendors who you feel comfortable working with. Not all vendors. You might say, look, I have a panel of 4 or 5 different companies that I prefer to work with because they're trusted partners. And that's known as a multi-sourcing concept. In recent years, we've seen a lot of insourcing. And what I mean by that is companies who outsource initially, but for whatever reason, they realize that it really isn't working, and so they decide to insource back what they previously outsourced. And that's something that's happened over the last few years as well. We're also seeing this idea of flexi-sourcing. And what I mean by that is outsourcing contracts becoming much more flexible these days and being less rigid than they were, say, 10 years ago. So these are some of the trends that we've seen in the outsourcing industry in the IT field over the last 20 years. I think outsourcing is a life cycle, and I think there are different phases to the life cycle. This is a diagram of the life cycle as I see it, and you want to focus on the bottom level there, because I think there are 6 different stages of the life cycle. I think it starts with a strategy stage, where the company thinks about whether or not outsourcing is the right strategic direction for it. There's a scoping stage, where the scope of what's being outsourced has to be crystallized. There's a vendor selection stage, where you choose the right vendors for your particular outsourcing project. You then have a transition stage, where you then look to transition over what you've decided to outsource. But there's also a relationship management stage, because once you've outsourced something, you still need to manage the relationship with the vendor. And finally, there's an evaluation stage, where over time you have to review what's happened, how successful the outsourcing relationship has been, and you have to decide whether or not you would like to continue with it, would like to revise it, or perhaps you'd like to move to a different vendor. And that's the evaluation stage. So I think there are 6 distinct stages in the outsourcing life cycle. Now, a very good example from Singapore is DBS, which is one of the major banks here in Singapore. They did a very large outsourcing deal with IBM worth $679 million US. That was a 8-year outsourcing deal, and DBS thought that it would obviously generate significant savings for them over a long period of time. And that deal involved consolidation of data centers and other support services. So this was an example of a very large outsourcing deal done in 2002. So this is 8 years ago. But actually, if you kind of wind the clock forward, what actually happened towards the latter part of the deal was that DBS actually decided to insource some of the services that it originally had outsourced to IBM. And it actually took back some of the IT staff that originally had transitioned over to IBM. And I think this is a very good example of the outsourcing life cycle in action, because the premises and the ideas that DBS had originally at the start of the outsourcing deal, obviously something changed over time, and it just demonstrates the fact that in a long-term outsourcing relationship, you have to continually actively manage, revise, and evaluate the life cycle. So what do you think are the main reasons why companies outsource? I'll just give you a minute or two to come to think about that. What are the main reasons why companies choose to outsource? Well, based on a study from the Outsourcing World Summit in 2004, you can see that the primary driver for outsourcing was to reduce costs. So 49% indicated that that was the primary driver. If you look at some of the other reasons, improve focus. A lot of companies wanted to focus more on their core competency. Some companies wanted to have a variable cost structure. So what that means is that if you have your own in-house IT department, that's a fixed cost to you, because you got to support the staff, you got to support the infrastructure. But if you want to move to a variable cost model, it's basically on the basis that you pay for what you get or for the services that you use, and that's more of an outsourcing model. Access to skill, because you may not have the relevant skills to do things in-house. That might be another reason why you outsource. Of course, there are some other reasons as well, to grow the revenue, to improve quality, to conserve capital, and importantly at the top there, to innovate. And I think this is increasingly an important area for companies. If you go back to the DBS example, DBS is a bank. It doesn't really have the capability to innovate in terms of technology services. And that's an area that IBM potentially can add value in. So there are lots of different reasons for outsourcing.